Today I'm going to be presenting to you a new concept or theoretical framework that we are currently working on as part of my work in the University of Milano Bicocca with Professor Maria Teresa Guasti. What I will be presenting about today is the Inefficient Anticipation Hypothesis, and this concept is based on the observation that individuals with dyslexia usually present with difficulties that go beyond their reading difficulties. So they usually present with difficulties not only in reading, but they also show difficulties in the domains of language and motor control. The idea is that we think that motor control, reading, and language are all domains that unfold on time. They all involve some kind of structural regularity, and we think that they are all underlined by a common factor, which is rhythm, and particularly anticipation. The idea that I'm going to be discussing today is that individuals with dyslexia present with inefficient anticipation mechanisms, and that this inefficient anticipation mechanism attributes to their difficulties that we observe in reading, handwriting, as well as language. So in today's talk, first I will present a brief introduction about dyslexia and the type of difficulties that we observe in individuals with dyslexia. I will follow that with explaining what rhythm is and how rhythm underlies these three domains, and then proceed to give evidence for the inefficient anticipation hypothesis. And finally, I will conclude with a brief discussion on the potential of rhythm on the potential of using rhythmic tasks in identifying dyslexia in bilingual children. So developmental dyslexia is a very common learning disorder. It affects approximately 7% of children, and that is approximately 1 in 14 children. Although the prevalence rates of dyslexia, they seem to vary from one study to another according to the definition and criteria that are used to define dyslexia across the different studies. Developmental dyslexia is characterized by a specific and a persistent difficulty in the decoding of written language. So usually individuals with dyslexia present with difficulties in reading fluently and reading accurately. These difficulties usually cannot be attributed to low intelligence or inadequate educational opportunities or any sensory or neurological damage. So these difficulties are usually described to be out of proportion of the child's intelligence levels and general development. Although reading seems to be the core area of deficit in individuals with dyslexia, it's not the only area that is affected in these children. Research has shown that children with dyslexia, they may show difficulties in the domain of language. Actually, one of the most reliable markers of developmental dyslexia of individuals with developmental dyslexia is their difficulties with phonology. So phonology refers to the sound system of the language, or the sound structure of words. And research has found that the representations, the storage, or the retrieval of speech sounds appears to be impaired in individuals with dyslexia. And this is evidenced by their poor performance on tasks that require them to manipulate sounds. For example, individuals with dyslexia, they have difficulties in counting how many syllables are there in a word, or identifying rhyming words, or identifying the first letter or first sound of a word, or putting sounds together to combine words. So they usually have difficulties in manipulating the sound structure of words, basically. And one of the most prominent theories of dyslexia, the phonological deficit theory, attributes a dyslexia to this phonological deficit. So they assume that the deficit that these children have in phonology seem to have a direct causal link to the reading difficulties in these children. It's because when we read, we basically, for each letter, we have to say the sound that is correlated with this letter. So because of the phonological difficulties, this foundation that's important for reading, which is the letter sound association, appears to be impaired in these children, which explains their dyslexia. Although a lot of research has mainly focused on the phonological difficulties in children or adults with dyslexia, actually there are other language difficulties that are usually observed in individuals with dyslexia that go beyond the weak phonological profiles that I have just described. For example, studies that have followed children who are at risk of a developmental dyslexia, such as children who have a family member with dyslexia, have found that these children usually have delayed language development. For example, these children would start speaking. They have a delay in the onset of talking. When they start talking, they would use shorter utterances. They would use less complex structures and words. They also seem to show general delays in the production and understanding of vocabulary, as well as morphosyntax, which is the grammar of language. So they show a general delay in their language development. And many studies have also found a high to moderate levels of a comorbidity between developmental language disorder and developmental dyslexia. So many individuals with dyslexia, they usually meet the criteria for developmental language disorder. And this term, developmental language disorder, refers to difficulties in using or understanding language. So it seems that there between 20 to 80% of children who are diagnosed with dyslexia, they meet the criteria of developmental language disorder, and vice versa. So these two disorders seem to co-occur. But also, it seems that there are, even if a child or an adult with dyslexia seem to be performing fine on standardized language tests, and studies that looked at the brain activity during language processing have revealed that individuals with dyslexia, they process language differently than adults. So they usually show atypical patterns or atypical brain activity when it comes to processing language. For example, if they're asked to judge the grammaticality of a sentence, individuals with dyslexia, they would perform fine if we look at the behavior level, but if we look at their brain activity, then we find differences. And studies have suggested that individuals with dyslexia have difficulties with the retrieval of implicit grammatical rules, and this could contribute to the differences in brain activity that we observe between children or adults and children with dyslexia versus typical controls. So these are generally some of the language deficits that we observe in individuals with dyslexia. We also seem to observe some motor deficits in individuals with dyslexia, especially on tasks that assess motor coordination, bead threading, posture stability or balance time, or tasks that require the coordination of fingers and so on. And similar to language, individuals or children who are at risk of dyslexia usually show delays in the acquisition of their fine and gross motor skills. So we've seen that individuals with dyslexia seem to show difficulties across reading, writing, and motor activities. All of these are domains that seem to unfold in time. And we think that all of these domains, they share a common thread. And we think that it is rhythm. So what is rhythm? There is no precise or any universally accepted or agreed on definition for rhythm, and there is a lot of definitions of rhythm in the literature. In this concept, or in this in our view, we have adopted this definition of rhythm, and it is that rhythm is a pattern of successive events and the perception of this pattern. With this definition, we can use it to distinguish between two components of rhythm. So when we talk about a pattern of successive events, so to have a rhythm, basically, we need to have a basic periodic pulsation. And usually that would be, for example, a series of, in music, if you think of it, it could be a series of sounds and silences. And usually, we can obtain this, for example, using a metronome. So we can get a series of metronome beats or a tactus. the other level of rhythm is basically our perception of this pattern. And it means that rhythm or a rhythmic structure usually has some level of temporal organization. And to explain this better, we can listen to some examples. So the first one, we said the first component is to have a series of sounds or silences, or a basic periodic pulsation. So that would be in music, as you see here, it's beats and with basically silences between these beats. So it would sound like this. Sorry if it's too loud. Okay, so what you basically heard is just a basic periodic pulsation. But in order to have a rhythm, these pulsations, they need to be grouped they need to be grouped in a particular pattern so we can obtain a rhythm. And this would be something like this. Could you hear me, by the way? Or could you hear the...
I can't.
Okay. Oh, you can't. Okay, maybe I can try to just... Sorry. Let's see. Could you hear it?
Yes.
Okay. So yeah, basically what we hear now is a basic periodic pulsation. But as I said, another level of, or another component of rhythm is to have a level of temporal organization. And if you see here, you can see that the beats or the pulses that we have are grouped, they are grouped in a particular pattern. And this is what gives us rhythm. So this is an example of a rhythmic pattern. This slide is always problematic. Anyways, I will try again. So basically, you could hear some kind of pattern when you listen to the second one, which has some kind of temporal organization, because the pulses were grouped in some kind of way. Okay, we're done with this. Okay. So if we want to produce a rhythmic behavior, according to the two components we have, there are two skills that we need to produce a rhythmic behavior. The first one is synchronization. So basically having a basic periodic pulsation allows us to coordinate our behavior with this periodic pattern. So it allows us to synchronize. But also having a level of temporal organization allows us to anticipate. So in order to produce a rhythmic behavior, we'll also need to be able to anticipate. And what this means that when we listen to a rhythmic pattern, our perception of an earlier segment of a rhythmic pattern allows us to make predictions about the later occurring segments in this pattern. So when we listen to, when we have rhythm, it means that we are able to extract some regularity from this pattern that we're listening to and make predictions about what will happen next or what will follow. And this is basically anticipation. So given that rhythm is composed of two areas, which are synchronization and anticipation, researchers have been interested in knowing how are these two skills are affected in individuals with dyslexia. One of the most, or actually the majority of the studies have mainly focused on the synchronization deficits in individuals with dyslexia. And what they have mainly found is that, or what they have mainly actually focused on is called beat synchronization, which is our ability to tap in time with a metronome beat or with a regular basic periodic pulsation. So if you look here, for example, we can see that we have a regular pulsation, and these are basically tones that are represented by the green circles. So the green circles represent a basic periodic pulsation, and we can see that there is a particular time, a period of time, a constant period of time between each two circles. So for example, there could be 500 milliseconds between the first beat, the second beat, and then another 500 between this one, and so on. In order to see if we're able to synchronize with a beat, what researchers would usually do is they compare the rate of our tapping to the rate of the original regular beat. So they would look at the intervals between the taps of the individual, and they compare this difference to the difference or to the rate of the original structure that we're listening to. So basically what has been found is that individuals, or particularly children with developmental dyslexia, they seem to have difficulties with entraining or synchronizing with fast tempos. So if they listen to a regular structure that has a fast rate, for example, 120 beats per minute, they seem to have a difficulty with synchronizing or tapping on time with these structures. But these children seem to have less difficulty when it comes, or no difficulty when they are asked to tap in time with a slow a rhythmic structure. What's interesting is that it has been shown that children with developmental dyslexia, they seem to be also less precise in their ability to tap in time. So if we look at each child and look at the taps of each child, we see that they are less precise or less consistent in their ability to tap in time with the metronome beat that they're listening to. A similar pattern have been observed in adults, but actually adults seem to have no problem in synchronizing with fast as well as slow temporal structures. So they don't have a difficulty in tapping at the right rate at fast or slow rhythmic structures, but they seem to have to be less consistent than typical adults in tapping at the right consistently to the metronome beat. So they can tap at the same rate, but they're less consistent in their ability in tapping at the correct rate. So this is the synchronization part of rhythm. And basically what we see that individuals with and without dyslexia, they seem to generally have a good ability in tapping at the right rate or synchronizing with rhythmic structures. And their difficulty seems to be more in terms of their consistency of tapping at the right rate. So because the synchronization skills, they seem to be somewhat preserved in individuals with dyslexia, we think that if synchronization is preserved, then maybe anticipation, or could anticipation skill of rhythm, could it be impaired? And could it be what's causing the timing precision difficulties that we see in individuals with dyslexia? To test this, Pagliarini in 2020 have conducted a study to assess the anticipation abilities of individuals with dyslexia. And what she basically used is a task that we call the warning imperative task. So in this task, individuals were first introduced to a familiarization stage in which they listen to a regular temporal structure, or like a basic periodic pulsation, just to familiarize them with the rhythmic structure, to allow them to extract some regularity from the structure. And then in the testing phase, the individuals heard the same exact sequence, but this time there were two random tones that were introduced. The first one, these two tones always occurred together. The first one was called the warning beat, and the purpose of the warning beat was to cue the arrival of the beat that will follow it, which is called the imperative beat. So when individuals heard the warning beat, they did not have to do anything. It was just for them to know that the imperative beat will happen and that they have to tap at the imperative beat. So the warning beat was to put the children or the individuals in in an anticipatory modality. And To do this, Pagliarini has tested this in 3 types of rhythm. So they tried it with a regular unstressed rhythmic pattern, with a regular strong weak rhythmic pattern, and then with an irregular rhythmic pattern where basically participants could not anticipate. What they were interested in is to look at the timing error. So if we look here, we can see that we have a warning beat, which occurs here, and then following it exactly, there will be a imperative beat. And participants, as I said, they had to tap at the imperative beat. What researchers were interested in is the timing error. Basically, the difference between the time of the participant's tap or response and the time of occurrence of the imperative beat. We can see here, for example, that the individual, if they tap before the beat, then we have a negative error. And this indicates that the participant anticipated that the imperative beat will happen, so they tapped before it happened. We can see another example where the participant have tapped after the beat, after the imperative beat. And here they were delayed. They were not able to anticipate the occurrence of the imperative beat. So looking at the timing error data from adults, we can see here that this line represents 0. So this line represents that the participant was able to tap exactly at the time of the imperative beat. Whereas the positive 50 to 150 basically indicates that they tapped after the beat, whereas the negative values indicate that the participants have tapped before the beat. What basically have been found is that individuals with dyslexia, adults particularly, they seem to be delayed, systematically delayed when it comes to tapping to the imperative beat. So we can see here that individuals with dyslexia, they tended to tap after the imperative beat has happened. But if we look at individuals with typical development, then we see that they either tap before or exactly at the time of the imperative beat. A similar pattern has been observed in children, and I think it's even more clear here that typical children, which are the ones in blue, they tended to tap either before, they most of the time have tapped before the occurrence of the imperative beat, whereas individuals with dyslexia were not able to anticipate, and they tended to tap after the beat. And this basically suggests that, again, children with dyslexia, individuals, basically adults as well as children, they seem to be delayed in their anticipation abilities. This has led to the proposal that children and adults with developmental dyslexia are poor at anticipating when they have to act, or knowing when do they have to act. And this anticipation deficit, we think that it could underlie the timing precision difficulties that I've just mentioned when we talked about the synchronization deficits in individuals with developmental dyslexia. If anticipation is impaired in individuals with dyslexia, then we expect that the performance of children and adults with dyslexia is going to be impaired in other tasks that involve anticipation. And these include handwriting, language processing, but also reading. To reiterate, we define anticipation as the ability to prepare for acting when it's required. It's to know when to act. Anticipation appears to be fundamental in behaviors that unfold in time, as I said, particularly those that require a precise timing and sequential ordering of behavioral patterns. So when we have to produce sequential behaviors in a timely manner. And these include, and such activities basically include handwriting, language, as well as reading. So how do we have anticipation in writing? Research generally shows that the temporal pattern of writing a given letter, it depends on the spatial and motor constraints of the adjacent letters, or the letters that are going to come next. For example, if we look here, we can see that the shape of the L sound, it depends on the letter that comes after it. So we can see that the ending of L here is a little bit longer, but if it's followed by a U, we can see that the tail, the ending tail of the L is actually shorter. So basically, the way we write a letter, it depends on the letter that's come. It's determined by the letter that comes next. And basically, what this means is that before we even start writing, we should be able to anticipate how are we going to write this letter based on what's coming next. So there is some kind of anticipation. So basically, our motor system is able to anticipate the typological information or moves that are required for the following letters. And because it anticipates, this is translated into the modification of the time that we spend in writing the current letter that we're writing. In handwriting, basically what we do is that we produce a series of continuous letters of different shapes, of different stroke directions, and of different sizes. And so in handwriting, we're generating a sequence of we're generating sequences basically of letters that we have to write in a timely manner so we can write fluently. And this is basically governed by two rhythmic principles. So in handwriting, we have two rhythmic principles. The first one is isochrony, which is the average movement speed, which is basically the idea that the average speed that we spend writing a word is pretty much the same regardless of the size of the word. So the absolute duration of writing a particular word is more or less the same. It's more or less invariant across different sizes. It's because when we write bigger, we also tend to write faster. So the time that we take to write a small word versus writing the same word in a bigger font, basically is going to be the same. So the absolute duration of writing the word appears to be constant. Hemorrhagity refers to the relative duration of the individual sounds within a word. So the proportion of time that we spend writing each letter within the word is more or less the same across different sizes or different speeds of writing a word. For example, here we can see, for example, in this word, it's an Italian word, purle. We can see that for the bout, the person would spend 25% of the time writing ba. If they decide to write this word bigger, so they're already writing it faster, they will still spend approximately 25% of the time on the ba sound. So that there is no changes in the relative duration of writing the individual letters of the word. So how these rhythmic principles are affected in individuals with dyslexia, this was investigated by Pagliarini in 2015. She basically assessed the handwriting abilities of school-age Italian speaking children with dyslexia compared to typical children, as well as those with dysgraphia. And what they were basically asked children to do is to write the word purle. They asked them to write the word spontaneously, to write it faster, and to write it bigger. In terms of the isochrony, as I said, isochrony means that when we write bigger, we have to write faster so that this duration of the word is going to be constant across different sizes. What Pagliarini has found is that individuals with dyslexia or children with dyslexia do not comply with with this principle. So if we see here, for example, if we look at the triangles, they represent typical children, and we can see that when they were writing spontaneously, for example, they spent they had a particular velocity, right, or a particular speed. When they were asked to write the word bigger, the speed increased significantly. We can see that here, the increase in speed for these children. If we look at individuals with dyslexia, which are the ones represented by the dark circles, we can see that they try to increase their speed when they wrote the word bigger, but it was much less. It was a much less increase compared to typical children. So they were not able to increase the speed as they increase the size of the word. If we look at hemorrhagity, which is the duration, the relative duration that we spend writing the individual letters, as I said earlier, that the individual or the duration in writing a particular letter should remain more or less the same across different speeds and different sizes. So here, if we look at the typical children, we can see that, for example, if we look at the B in the beginning, they spend more or less the same time on writing B across the spontaneous and big conditions. But if we look at individuals with dyslexia, we can see that it took them actually much longer to write the B letter compared to the typical children. So there was a change in the relative duration. They were not able to maintain it, which means that individuals with dyslexia were not able to comply with the Hemorrhagity principle. One might say that maybe individuals with dyslexia had this difficulty with the rhythmic principles because they're not exposed to writing as much as typical children because of their difficulties, obviously. But Pagliarini has found that children at the age of 6 years and after only a minimal time of exposure to formal schooling, they're able to comply with the these principles, the rhythmic principles of writing. So these principles are available at the children at the very start of their schooling. So it's not related to exposure. And okay, so this is for handwriting. We've just shown that individuals with dyslexia, they are unable to comply with the rhythmic principles of handwriting. Another domain that we said is impaired in individuals with dyslexia is language processing. And we know anticipation is involved in language processing because many models, they state that individuals are able to extract contextual information. So we can extract information from the sentence to make predictions about words that will follow later in the sentence before we even hear these words. And basically, this is an indication that these individuals predict and that we are able to predict during language processing. And evidence for this have basically been documented through eye tracking studies in which adults as well as children have been shown to do or show evidence of language modulated anticipatory eye movements. For example, one of the studies that investigated predictive language processing in adults with dyslexia was by Hwittig and Brouwer. And what they basically did is that they read simple sentences to the participants. And then using eye tracking, they wanted to see at whether the participants are able to extract information about the target word from the determiner that was produced in these sentences. For example, they would ask in Dutch, this study was done in Dutch, the determiner could carry information about the gender of the upcoming noun. So for example, here the D could be used to, is used for common nouns, whereas het is produced for neuter nouns. So basically, when somebody, or if a person listens to or hears D or de in a sentence, they should be able to predict the word that will come next is going to be a common noun, and they should guess that this is going to be a piano. So out of the 4 reference, they should start looking at the piano before the word piano is already said. And this is what these researchers have found. If we look here at this graph, it basically shows the proportion of looks to the target, which is piano in this case, for example, in individuals with and without dyslexia. So we see here that at 2000 milliseconds was the time at which the word piano was produced. But we can see that individuals with typical language development, as well as those with dyslexia, they have already started looking at the word piano before the word was said. So they started looking at it after they heard the determiner. But the only difference is that individuals with typical development, which are in red, they started looking at the target approximately a half a second after the onset of the determiner. Whereas individuals with dyslexia, which are represented with the black line, they started looking at the target approximately basically 1.5 seconds after the determiner was said. So it means that both individuals with and without dyslexia were able to extract gender information from the determiner to predict the upcoming noun, but individuals with dyslexia, they seem to be delayed. We also have anticipation in reading. And basically, we know that when we read, it's basically a series of saccadic movements and fixations. So when we fixate on a word, the amount of information we obtain from this single fixation is referred to as the perceptual span. How much visual information can we obtain from the text that's in front of us? And when we look, when we are fixating, we don't just see the word that we are reading, but we can also see the upcoming words and the upcoming letters in a text. And so actually it has been found that the perceptual span usually extends to the direction of reading. For example, in English, we read from left to right. So our perceptual span appears to be larger to the right side. It means that we're able to see up to 14 to 15 letters to the right from the fixation point that we have during reading. So we will be reading one word, but our eyes will scout further to scan the upcoming letters in the text that we're reading. And this is evidence for anticipation, that before we even reach or move our eyes toward the upcoming letters, we're already processing them through parafoveal processing. To illustrate this, there is a phenomena called the eye voice span, which basically measures the distance or the time that our eyes are ahead of our voice during oral reading. For example, here we have a sentence. At the time that a person is reading the word un, which is the first word in this sentence, we can see that their eyes are already at the letter da. So their eyes are already around 10 letters ahead from their voice. So when they're uttering un, they're already looking at 10 letters ahead. Usually the eye voice span has been estimated to be between 15 and 17 letters. So what how eye voice span is like in individuals with dyslexia. What research basically has found that individuals with dyslexia seem to have a narrower eye voice span compared to typical individuals. That is, they get to see when they scan upcoming letter, they scan much less number of letters compared to individuals with typical language. And we can see here in this graph, we can see in the graph one for a control reader that the eyes are usually ahead of the voice by a constant space of time. If we look at B, we can see that in individuals with dyslexia, that the eyes are much closer to the voice. So they're not able to look further ahead from the fixation point during reading. And actually research has found that the eyes of children of developmental dyslexia are on average, they can scan about 8 letters ahead of their fixation point and ahead of their voice. But individuals with typical language, they can scan up to 14 letters. So the eye voice span in individuals with dyslexia appear to be almost half of that of typical developing children. So basically the studies on eye voice span have shown that having a smaller eye voice span is correlated with slower reading. So if we're not able to predict or anticipate or scan upcoming letters, then we're going to be slower in reading. And actually this is also supported by evidence showing that poor readers usually have also a narrower eye voice span compared to typical readers. So it seems that eye voice span is important for reading fluency, and this is also indicated by the fact that those who have a slower or narrower eye spans, they tend to fixate longer in words, they tend to make shorter forward saccades, and they tend to make more regression. So it means that they are less fluent in reading. They spend more time processing the words because they are not benefiting from the eye voice span, which allows them to pre-process material before they even reach them. So basically what I have shown is that anticipation is evident in handwriting, in language, and in reading. I've shown that in handwriting, anticipation is evident in that before we start writing, we need to know or we decide the way that we write a letter or a word based on what's going to come next, whether it was a size or whether it was the shape of the letter that's going to come next. We've shown that individuals, particularly children with dyslexia, do not comply with the rhythmic principles of handwriting. We showed that language also involves anticipation, especially in language processing, in which we're able to predict things or words that will come in the sentence before we even hear them. And we've shown that adults and children with dyslexia seem to be delayed in terms of their predictive language processes. So they can predict, but they're much more delayed compared to typical individuals. We also showed that anticipation seems to also be evident in reading, particularly as indicated by the phenomena of eye-voice span. And we have shown that individuals with dyslexia seem to have narrower eye-voice span. So if anticipation, and if our theory is correct, if anticipation is evident in these three domains, then we expect to see correlations between these domains that are mediated by anticipation, or particularly rhythm. For example, the performance of children in the non-linguistic anticipation tasks, such as the warning imperative, seem to be correlated with the individual's ability to read. So, for example, it has been found that the timing error on the warning imperative task, so how accurate are we in anticipating, appear to be correlated with reading speed as well as with non-word reading errors. So that basically children who made more timing errors, they seem to be slower readers, and they also seem to be to make more errors when it comes to their non-word reading or reading non-words. Also, there seems to be correlations between handwriting as well as reading. So children who write fast, or who write faster, basically, they also seem to read words and non-words faster, and they also seem to have better vocabulary, and they also seem to make less mistakes in reading. But also, researchers have found that the ability of a child or a person to comply with the isochrony principle of handwriting, which is basically writing faster when we write a big word, it seemed to be positively correlated with the speed of reading words and non-words. So those who were able to write faster when they wrote bigger, they also were able to read faster, read words and non-words faster. And this suggests that there is a correlation between handwriting and a reading that is anticipated by rhythmic competence. There also seems to be evidence showing that there are correlations between predictive language processing and reading. For example, the ability to look at the target before it is said in a sentence have been shown to be correlated with the reading ability in adults. Studies have also shown that the ability or individual differences in predictive language processes also correlated with the speed of reading non-words, and that it also correlated with the accuracy of children to anticipate beats on the warning imperative task, which suggests that both the predictive language processing tasks as well as the what is it called? Sorry. The predictive language processing, as well as the performance on the warning imperative tasks, they both seem to rely on some kind of anticipation mechanisms. So basically, we think anticipation is common core in reading, writing, and in reading, language, and handwriting. We think that it is possible that this common core basically consist of being able to use hierarchical or abstract hierarchical representations to make predictions or to anticipate or to prepare to act. So basically, we think that the inefficient anticipation of individuals means that these participants are unable to extract a regularity maybe from abstract hierarchical representations to make to prepare to act or to anticipate future events. So basically, individuals with dyslexia seem to have to be poor at anticipating, and this is why they seem to have difficulties with reading, writing, and as well as handwriting. So how is this all relevant to bilingualism? So we know that individuals with bilingual children, usually their skills in the second language that they're acquiring, it seems to vary according to several factors, including the age at which they started being exposed to the language, the length of period that they were exposed to the language, as well as the quality of their exposure to the language or the richness of their environment. We also know that typical children, typical bilingual children, they seem to underperform monolingual peers on measures of their second language, whether it was reading or language in general. So bilingual children, they seem to perform a little bit below typical children on measures of, for example, reading and language. And we think, and actually research has shown that the bilingual children, they also seem to obtain lower reading scores if they were exposed to the second language after the age of 3. So there seems to be a gap between bilingual children, bilingual typical children, and monolingual typical children. And there also seems to be some overlap in the language as well as the reading profiles of bilingual children. And this overlap makes it really difficult for clinicians basically to diagnose reading and language difficulties in these children. And we know that this L2 gap, or the gap in reading and language, it seems to persist for some time for children, particularly in the early years of acquiring the new language or the second language that they are exposed to. And all of these facts, they basically mean that many children or bilingual children with typical development seem to be overdiagnosed or sometimes misdiagnosed, especially when it comes to the evaluation of their reading and language abilities. So one of the major challenges for clinicians is knowing whether the lower language and reading abilities in individuals with dyslexia, or with bilingual children, is it due to a disorder, or is it due to a typical stage of their second language acquisition? So we know that measures that rely on language knowledge, such as, for example, standardized language tests, or standardized reading tests, they rely on our language knowledge. And we know that the language knowledge of children with bilinguals, it depends basically on their factors of their exposure. So their knowledge is not always controlled, and they seem to perform below. If we want to use language knowledge measures, bilingual children may underperform monolingual children, as I have just discussed. So it is very important to look for non-linguistic measures that allow us, or that are sensitive to the difficulties to reading or language difficulties, but at the same time minimize the effect of language exposure on the. Basically, we want them to have minimize the role of language-specific knowledge. We don't want performance on this task to be mainly relying on the language knowledge, which we know that varies a lot in individuals with bilingual exposure. We think that tasks that look at rhythm might have potential in terms of diagnosing dyslexia in bilingual children, because as I've just shown, that there are correlations between performance on rhythmic tasks, particularly those that involve anticipation or synchronization, and handwriting and language, as well as reading. So these are non-linguistic tasks, but maybe we could use them to help us understand and diagnose or identify individuals with dyslexia better. And so one of the studies that we're currently working on is basically to investigate the rhythmic clinical markers of individuals with dyslexia. And we're interested to see whether we could use rhythm to identify monolingual as well as bilingual children with dyslexia, and find out which tasks could help clinicians identify reading deficits in individuals with basically dyslexia. We were also interested in understanding the correlations between rhythm, language, and reading, not only in monolinguals, but we also want to extend this to bilinguals. And this is one of the projects that we're currently working on. I wanted to present some data on this project, but unfortunately our data looks very messy. So we're still trying to figure out the best way to make use of it. So I will leave it to this brief discussion, but feel free to ask me if you would like to know more about our current work on bilinguals. The presentation that I did today, it was based on most of the work that has been done by people at the Bicocca language group. So this is to acknowledge their efforts, especially Professor Maria Teresa Guasti, in which she basically developed this theory, and most of what I presented were her thoughts and ideas. Thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.